Welcome to Simulation and Prototyping. For this tutorial, I wanted to revisit a couple of past tutorials that we've used before, just in a very light way. And I want to build on the work that we did in the last tutorial with LadyBug and use LadyBug as a way to help us size and customize some facade panels. So you'll need 3 plugins for this tutorial. The first one is Lunchbox, which if you've been following these and working in class, Lunchbox is a plugin that we've already used. LadyBug, which we'll reuse or we used in our last tutorial. And the new plugin for this tutorial is SkinDesigner, which is a facade panel and facade panel management tool that will allow us to do what we see on the screen here. I'm not going to modify too much here, but it'll make more sense as we build this and go through it exactly what's happening. But to show you, we're going to use LadyBug, and the color plot that we see along the side has to do with, let's say, good and bad radiation. And so the good radiation here, the positive radiation is from the south. It's easily controlled. It's low in the winter and it's high in the summer. And so that's the purplish color. And you can see that these panels, the glass, there's more glass on this side because it can be controlled. And as we move around, you'll see some of the glazing that's on the other side. The windows have been minimized as a way to deal with that. And so the focus for me is not necessarily on the LadyBug component, and I'm actually going to give you that component as part of this. But as you get into this type of work and as you start to take more classes in this area and start to skill up in this, you can be able to customize. But for the focus of this tutorial, we're really just going to take that analysis and take it as a kind of accept it as in terms of what it is, and use it as a parameter to size the window openings in the facade panels. So we'll work through some of these things now. We can see we've got, with the SkinDesigner tool, we also have options for either vertical or horizontal shading, the glass and the panel. And as we look closer, what I'm doing is randomizing the size of the panels. And as the panels drop below a certain dimension, I think 3 or 4 feet, the window is removed as well. And so we're going to embed some intelligence within those elements. And this tutorial is really a conflation of 2 or 3 other tutorials that you may find on YouTube as well. But what I wanted to do was to use the SkinDesign tool with the random panel sizing, and we're going to do that with Lunchbox, the random size panels. Then we'll use LadyBug with the positive and negative separated out radiation, and then we'll use the SkinDesign tools. So why don't I'll give this one last spin. We can take a look at what we're going to be producing, and I will get rid of this grasshopper, and let's see, well, this is the base. So all I need to do is just delete these objects. Let's see, I don't think it'll let me delete this layer. deletes everything on the layer. So what you will get as part of the class is a series or a set of geometry. We'll have the topography set by a series of points. This is then created with a patch surface. This revisits something that we did early on in the semester. And there are facades here, but they've already been collected, and I'll show you how that is done. What we see displayed on the screen are the slabs. For the purpose of this tutorial, the slabs are also just a surface. So they're thin, paper thin. But we could get into some of the workflows and talking about what happens as those become thick and the ways that we could deal with the facade panels. The other thing that I've done, if we just take a look at the grasshopper side of things, I've set a north arrow that you can spin around, and you can change where north is. The 0 is in the positive y-axis. And so I'm going to start with this around 30, 40 degrees, kind of coming at the angle that we see on the screen. There are a couple of other points here that we can use for our skin design. The SkinDesigner for the individual panels, and then we can see one panel versus the panels that are there. So let's see what we've got. The skin design tool, just like LadyBug, needs one tool to be placed in it in order to activate it. It's this first tool in the top left. That's already been done for you. The bifocals I'm also using here. I know that some people prefer the icons, and the bifocals gives us the titles above, which I think is useful for people that are following along. So what else do we have? I've put the individual facades, which we can see the ground floor, the first floor, the second floor, as individual containers for the surfaces here. And so we'll work with those and build up from there. The other thing, as we zoom out and take a look, this is the patch surface. And so we can just see the contours and the topography there. So it's just displayed. I could have baked it and put it there, but I just thought it would be interesting to revisit. I think it was our second assignment of working with a topography. And so we can see that there coming back. The next big block is the solar radiation. And this is LadyBug. You can choose a site. If you go back to the weather data and drop in the URL for there, so you can choose a different location. And basically what we're doing is we're bringing in the opaque geometry as well as the glazing. We're going to look at the glazing as it relates to the solar radiation. And so like last week, we're pulling in the sky data, the EPW data, and then this is being manipulated slightly to just begin to look at a couple of things: building balance point and the deadband offset. These having to do with the dry bulb temperature, looking at kind of above and below a certain range, and then splitting this out given the analysis period and dropping it into the radiation analysis, and then splitting these things out so that we're getting the positive and negative. We can see the colors here that we saw earlier. And really what we're doing, we'll get a mesh out of that as a way of color plotting that on the building. And then we're also going to get a text file or a list. This list is going to give us the radiation on each of those facade surfaces. from that, we'll plug it in and we'll use that as a way to size our window openings. So let's start with this. And what I'd like to do is to begin breaking down the facades using these elements. And we're going to process them separately. And I'll explain as we get into it a little bit why, but we're going to first work with them independently in the way that we're subdividing it using Lunchbox. So let me explain this process first. So what we're going to do is we're going to reverse our surface and let's see, let's take a look at this. The first thing maybe that we can do and I'll take a little bit more time with the first one, and then we'll just copy these and update them. So we're going to use Lunchbox, and we're going to use a really kind of great tool here, which is random quad panels. And so I was thinking about this in the context of your design studio work and just wanting to kind of begin to approximate some notion of a facade and give a little bit more detail to a project that you might be working on. So let's we're going to end up revising this slightly, but let's plug our first surface in and we can see what happens. I'm just going to hide the slabs for a second. You can see the curves are still there. We're going to have some U and V divisions. And let's see, maybe I'll just I want to change this in a second, but I'll say 0 is less than 25. And we can plug this into both. And then I'm going to make a seed value as well. I'll say 0 is less than 200. That just gives us a kind of big range to be able to adapt that. So let's plug these into U and V, and we'll see what happens. So 0 doesn't make any sense. So we can see that the V divisions are the vertical, and the U divisions are the plan differences. And so as we increase this, we can see it also begins to more closely approximate the curved form of the building. And we can also see as we increase these, what starts to happen. So really what we want to do is we're going to flip them U and V. Actually, what I'd like to do is just set the V to 1. So I'm going to do this with a panel, and I can do /1. This way I can just set that to 1 because we just want full height panels. And that will be fine. And our seed value is okay. And that seems to work fine for what we're doing. And maybe this is even a little simpler than what I was looking at a second ago. And so we'll leave that as it is. And I think this will work. And so let's just clean this up slightly. I do want to keep the U divisions, but before we copy this, why don't we increase the max to 500? And this will allow us we can see a kind of range of those. They seem a little uniform. Nothing seems to be happening. So I wonder if that's the This just seems like a uniform division. Let me try one thing, because what I did previously was to reverse the surface. And so let's see what happens if we bring this in. We'll reverse the surface, and this gives us a couple of options. So as I right click on, actually as I mouse over, we can see that 0 is do nothing, 1 is reverse, 2 is reverse V, 3 is reverse UV. So let me plug in // 3, because I want to flip U and V. That then seems, this must be why it was the other way. Now we can see that we're getting a random split, some panels long, some panels short, in this direction as we move around. So we'll keep the reverse surface. We'll have the panel. I'm just going to clean these up because we're going to copy it and use it. So we can hide the reverse surface. And now we have the random surfaces here. As we change the seed, those will change, and we can change these, and it looks to be, we can come back maybe 150 to 200 in that range for this one. I'm going to group these together. And then I'm just going to copy them 5 more times. And you can imagine what we'll do is we're just going to swap out the surfaces for these. And let's see. Well, let's do that. So we'll plug in these, just going down the list. Now we've got all of the facades. I can turn back on the slabs. And you can see the bottom, so 0, 4, and 5 have a shorter dimension, leaving 1, 2, and 3 a little bit longer. So I'm going to increase 1, 2, and 3. Just thinking about the kind of the number of divisions randomly split generates a panel of a certain size. And again, we'll be able to come back and revisit those. I want to take this, the geometry from these panels, and entwine them. This just allows us to manage these. So we'll plug each of these in. As we zoom in, we can add enough slots for each of the floors. And we've got that. So we can hide the random subdivisions. Now we've got the entwine all as one. And now let's take this, and what I want to do is get the dimensions of these surfaces. So I'm going to make a surface container. To collect them, I can hide the entwine. And from here, let's get a surface dimensions. We're going to use this to set the size of our panels, or the maximum size of our panels. So we can get our U dimensions and our V dimensions. And what I want to do is just, because I want to pull the maximum, I'm going to just grab the bounds of each. And this will tell us the smallest number and largest number for each of the U and V divisions. We can create a panel, and just so we can check this for both of them. We'll see that the geometry is grafted. We don't want it grafted because we don't care about the largest and smallest from each surface. We want them overall. And so I can flatten these as they come out of the U and the V. And we can see that the V dimension is 13 to 13. Each floor or each facade is the same height. And so that's easy. We understand that V represents the height. And then the U dimension, the maximum size currently is 35. And so we want this to be able to, as we change those, to be able to capture that dimension. And so the way that we'll do that is we will deconstruct the domain. And this is something that we've used previously as well. And we'll get, I believe, the end. Yep. And the end. Although for the V, it doesn't matter because they're both 13. This will be, we'll keep the panels. It's an easy way for us to keep track of these. So we've got those, and we'll use that. Let's move to the solar radiation study now, given these surfaces. So you can change your site. Don't remember what it's set to. I believe it's set to Boston. And let's see. We need our opaque geometry. And what's coming in currently for the opaque geometry is the topography, but I also want to add a geometry pipeline. And for this, we want to use the slabs. Set this to surfaces, and we'll hold down Control and add this to building opaque geometry. And then we want building window geometry. And so this is going to be our surfaces that we just created. And let's pull in the surfaces. So that worked already. And if your computer's a little slower as you're doing other things, we may want to change the boolean toggle for the radiation analysis. So let's take a quick look at this and see what's happening. Let's hide a couple of things. We can hide our slabs. We can also, I'm not sure if the dimensions do anything. We can hide our surfaces now because of the far end of the LadyBug analysis, we have this mesh. Oh, and I just hid the mesh expecting this to change. Okay, so the recolor mesh will give us the legend as well. And it's also giving us the mesh on the facade. At a point later, this gives you the option of just hiding the legend and also just having the facade surfaces there. So that's why we pulled the mesh out. But for now, we'll keep the legend present, and we can see the positive. And so the north currently is pointing in this direction on the screen. So what we're seeing is that these are the south facing panels. If we want to change the north, do that all the way up at the top left in the canvas. And we'll see as we rotate this around, there's a little bit of a lag because LadyBug is running. So we can see it changing ever so slightly. So now north is in our direction. As we pan around, we start to see more purple surfaces, which is the south facade. So you can play with that a little bit. If your computer's slow, I'd recommend finding the toggle, set that to false, come back to the rotation. Here I'm looking down at the circle on the bottom, and you can set that to where you want it, and then you can turn that back on, or turn the toggle to true, and then it'll do the LadyBug analysis, and we'll see here's the south facade. So that's one area of input that you have within this. So that gets us to the point where we've got our analysis. We've got a randomized set of surfaces. Let's take a look at what's coming out. We know that we have the mesh coming out. I'm going to add a panel here just temporarily. And what we end up with is a list of all of our facade panels and the solar radiation that's hitting them. And so as we scan through this, we can see it's minus 150 to plus 150. And so we'll use these values as we begin to work with the SkinDesign tool. So let's take a look at this now, and we'll get into this. So the way that the SkinDesign tool works is, let's pull it up above. So here's SkinDesigner, and we can see a set of panels and skin generator and parameters. We can then see parameters related to window, curtain wall, and a couple different shading systems. We have some controllers, and we'll use these to set our heights. And then we have some display functions in terms of displaying the geometry within Grasshopper. For the most part, what's happening is that the geometry is going to be generated and dropped into the different layers within Rhino. And so let's get a sense of how this works and what the workflow is like. So the first thing that I want to do is to set a wall panel. And so we'll do this by coming up to the top, up to parameters. And let's get SkinDesigner System Wall. We'll drop this here. We also want a window. And so it's this SkinDesigner window. You can drop it underneath. I'm going to do these things kind of vertically as we move through, as they plug into one another. And then the last one I want to get is the shading. And so we can line all three of these up. And we'll plug in a couple of values. The Rhino file is set to feet. And so if we're going to do something with less than feet, we can either do a fraction or we can do it with a division of 12. But I'm going to do this mostly with panels. So I'm going to plug in a panel here, and the window frame width, I'm going to set just as 0.15. And we'll see in a second, we can vary these and we'll get a better sense of what each of them are doing. For the window, let's look at a couple of things. Well, I want to change this once we start generating them. But for now, let's start with, we can use a few kind of labels or names within these. And so one is panel width and panel height. And so the window system, we want to set the width of this to be the width of the whole panel. And we'll come back and we'll change that. We'll change it by multiplying it by a fraction as a way to make it less than that. We want to leave the height alone here because we're going to work in a way that will allow the height to vary. So we'll leave that alone. And for the window being recessed into the panel, I do want to set this, and I'll set it to be 0.25. And again, we'll come back and change these once we get a sense for viewing it. For the shading device, let's start with the width. And the width is really the depth that this is projecting from the facade. And so let's set this to be 2 for 2 feet for the projection of the shading element. For vertical orientation, we can set this to be 0 or 1, or we can use true or false. So setting this to 0 makes it a horizontal louver. Setting it to 1 will make it vertical. And we'll come back. Actually, let's add another 0 or 1 to window shade. And setting it to 0 is false, so that our shading element will be the entire width of the panel. As we change this to 1 to be true, the shading device will only be over the glazing. We'll see, just trust me, we'll see how these work, and we'll come back in a second. So we have these 3 components now that will all work together. What we have to do is plug these into a SkinDesigner system panel. And that's going to be this up here is going to be the system panel. And what we'll do is we'll plug in panel system, window system, shading system. So those will get plugged in here. Let's name this. I can do, let's create a little bit more room. Name it. We'll use a panel for this. Let's say it's really just a string, so it doesn't matter too much, just as long as it'll help us recognize this later. For should help us recognize it within our layers. We need to activate this, so we're going to make another boolean toggle. And I just want to group this. If I right click and make a rectangular outline and change the color as well. So we want to be able to use this and recognize kind of the key elements that we'll have to activate. You can see we've done this here too. So this can be intensive. And so if we want to make changes at the early stage, or we want to re-randomize the panels, we want to make sure to turn these to false. So we have that. Let's set our width and our height. Well, one more thing. Let's do one more panel while we're here. // The thickness of the panel will set to 6 inches. And we have that. And so now our width and our height will be set from those surface dimensions that we had before. And so our height is going to be 13. So let's pull from the domain, pull that 13. We have to come all the way past the LadyBug. And this is going to be height. And then we want to pull our width. Actually, I'm going to pull this whole thing down. I can even pull these down. And then from our deconstruct domain for the end, this is going to be our width. Okay. So that looks good. Let's see. Now we plug this into another one of these tools. We plug it into the skin generator. And this will be another moment where we really we can actually use our activate. So we'll activate these together. The panel is going to plug into the panel 1. We can get rid of 2 and 3. And the other thing that I want to do, just so that we can get a sense of what's happening, is I want to have the SkinDesigner panel viewer. And this is a kind of independent element, so we can plug our panel into the panel. We want to have a point. So I'll set the point for the location point. I'm just going to set this to be one of the points. So we'll set one point near our north arrow. So we have that. And let's see, draw geometry, draw B-reps. Let's have it draw B-reps. And maybe I don't want to confuse. I think we can do true and false. Let's see. Invalid panel number in panel bay input and panel input data missing. Okay, this is because we don't have, this would maybe be a moment where, let's disable that one. Nothing's happening because nothing's coming out of the panels because we had that set to false. So let's see, as we set this to true, this changes, there's no more arrow, and let's preview it. So here's our panel, our first panel. And what we can see, and we can modify a couple of things here too if we want, is, let's see. This is the overall panel. The window is here and it's the full width, and the shading element is across the top and not connected to the window. So let's make a couple of changes here while we're just changing one before we populate this into everything. So even if we zoom in, let's take a look at what the first number is doing. So let's change the window frame width from 0.15, maybe just to 1. So now we can see that's basically the mullions that are wrapping around the window. It's really exaggerated. So let's go back to 0.15. And now we can see the way that that works. And it's basically at the seam, it's split between the two because of the panel width. Let's change the panel width while we're here. so we can see this. And actually, I thought maybe we would get preview. No. So let's look at, well, the thickness, the 6 inches. Let's change that to be 1, just so we can get a sense for how that changes. We can see the panel just moved in terms of its thickness. We can go back to 0.5. And let me show you a couple more things. So the width, this is the width of the window. We can see if we go into panel width, we can also say times 0.5. This means that the window will be half the overall width. And so now we can see it's centered and it's split the difference between the two. And so if we want to get it maybe close, maybe 0.75 gets us a little bit of wall on either side of the window. The recess is just where the glass is located in relationship to this. So let's set this to be, we know that our full panel is 0.5. So let's set the glass at 0.5. We can see the glass moved all the way back to the inside, but maybe a little too far. Maybe we'll set this to be 0.4. And so we can have that set all the way back, or let's see if we say 0. You see that moves out. And I believe we can also set this to be a minus. And so we saw the glass come out even further. I'm going to go with the recessed glass, maybe 0.35. So let's set just a little bit back. And then the shading, let's look at a couple of these elements. So the vertical orientation, if we change that to 1, it will become a vertical shading element. And we can see it's located at the edge of the panel. I want to come back to set that back to 0 for a second and show you the difference where now the shading element is at the top. If we change the width, maybe we'll go to 4, it'll be twice as deep. So we see that coming out 4 feet. And if we set window shade to be true, in other words, to change that to 1, this is going to make it just at the height and at the width of the window. So that's a really kind of smart, really simple true false or boolean condition, but gives us some intelligence within the shading element. So that's nice as well. So let's set this, well, we can leave these as they are. All of these things seem to be working, and that's good. Let's take a look at what else we need to do. So we're going to use the skin generator, and let's even copy our toggle in case we want to look at the individual panel versus all of the panels. So what the skin generator is going to do is we're going to map this smart element to the geometry of the building. And so with this, we have our panel plugged in, we have whether or not to activate it, and the only other thing we need to get started are the surfaces. And so we can see skin surface list. This is going to be our surfaces. Trying to straighten things up a little bit here. This is going to be our surfaces that were entwined. So as we come all the way back, I'm going to pull from this element, from the surfaces. We'll come all the way over, and it was skin surface list. There we go. And you can see something happening down here at the bottom. You can see my Rhino thinking a bit. And what it's doing is it's generating all of the surface panels now, or should be. All right, there we go. So we have some surface panels generated. Let me hide a couple of things. Let's hide our radiation analysis. And now we can see our surface panels. Amazingly, our top two levels are perfectly lined up, even though they're different lengths. So we'll take a look at that. So we can see a few things going on. We've got our shading elements. And so I want to fix a couple of things. We're going to set or write a small rule that if a panel is less than a certain size, we want to get rid of the window. And so let's do that. And then we can also look at the shading elements, which I think look a little silly right now. And then we're going to set the window heights based on the radiation as well. So let's see. First things first, I do want to change the randomization of the top level. And so before I do that, I want to just be sure to turn that to false. Come all the way over, and that should be our top surface. And we can see they do line up here. And the reason is because they have the same seed. Now they're a little bit different, but I'm also going to change the 166 just to be a few more, just so they're definitely not the same. I can hide both of these. And so let's go after the, let's see, well, reinitiate this and let it generate. And next I want to add that conditional rule for deleting the window if the panel is less than a certain size. So we'll take a look at that. And so we do see some instances. Here is a very narrow window. Here's a very narrow window. And so throughout all of these, we can write a relatively simple rule, and we're going to add it with a definition in here. And I'm going to do that with a panel. And so let's set the panel. And this is going to be add conditional definition. And it has to be spelled correctly. Parentheses, single quote, panel width, less than, let's say less than 4 feet. Let's close this, close the single quotes, comma, single quote, delete window, open and close parentheses, single quote, and then close parentheses. We'll see if this works. If it gives us an error, we know that I typed something incorrectly. If it works, we should see some of these small windows go away, as well as the shading. Because the shading is tied to the window, the shading will go away. And let's see. So the shading and the window both went away. Let's do one more thing while we're here. Let's change the glass from gray to just give it a little bit of a glass color. So now we can see that differentiation through the color on the facade. Okay, so we have that working. Let's take a look now. Let's use the solar radiation. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use a rule that will set the height. And so the way that this works is we're going to use a panel controller. And so the panel controller is here. And I'm going to use the legacy panel controller because it allows us to use a min and a max. So I'm going to drop that in here. The panel controller will plug in the output of this, will plug into the skin generator. So as we're generating that, oh, and maybe I should have deactivated the generation. And this is the thing, this can be quite intensive, and these toggles are really useful in that I want to turn them to false as I'm working on anything with these. So let's set a couple of things. The first is that we've got a couple of controller parameters, and these live up under number 3. And what we want is the window panel controller. And as we put this in, we can see we get this long element and a pull down menu. What we want to set is the height. And so this will be our, what will this be? This will be our system parameter. So this will get plugged into the top. Our data list is going to be our radiation benefit, solar radiation benefit from the LadyBug analysis. We'll plug this into our data list. And this is what we're going to use that data to size or change the height of the windows in the panel. And so let's just set this as, I want to set the min and the max, and I'm going to do these with a couple of panels. So the min, let's set it to be 3 feet. So we can see value min. We'll do value max. And we know that the total panel height is 13. So maybe we'll set this to be 11 as the maximum height of the window. And then the number of samples is a kind of interesting thing that allows you to set. So what we could have are just 2 opening sizes if we set the number sample to 2. What I'm going to do is set it to 8. And so I'll do a panel with 8. This will give us 1 foot increments if we set the panel sampling to 8. If we wanted it in 6-inch increments, we could set this to 16. Where I get 8 is just 11 minus 3. And so that will be each step between the min and the max would be 1 panel type. If we wanted to have a really subtle range, we could increase them. Basically, the number of samples would be the amount of customization. Here, again, remember, this is just the customization of the height of the window. Right now, currently, all of our windows are the same width, or sorry, are all custom widths because of the randomization of the overall panels. We could set our window to be all standard within the panel, though, if we wanted to play with some of those things, and we could take a look at that. So I believe we have everything that we need here to set this. This is already plugged in and ready to go. Let's set this to true and see if it generates them. Okay, so what we see now are a set of panels. And so the height of the windows, and if we go back, we could even turn back on maybe our mesh here. Actually, it might be more helpful to turn on the legend. So we can see our positive radiation. We're getting, should be getting taller windows, which we can see here. And then for the negative radiation, where that gets more intense, those are getting, should be getting smaller. Looks a little, well, we can see maybe much smaller height windows on this side. We're also getting some self-shading because of this facade is underneath these elements. So let's set that. Let's take a look. I actually want to change the shading device. And so I do want it to be vertical. I'll set that to be 1. This will all update. And so what I would suggest now is that we've worked through all of the kind of key components for this. You can now tinker with the individual elements. And I think let's see. I think because of the curvature and because of what's happening, our tool here, let's see, unless there's a way. I thought there was a place where we could change the location. I'm not seeing it. I just don't like how the panels are coming or how the analysis is coming out in front. But now we can see vertical panels. We can see a range in terms of the heights. But I would now play with the width of your panels. Here we can see the recess, the depth of our shading device, whether or not it's vertical, whether or not it follows the window. You can set the thickness of the panel, the name, and then here's the other range. We can go from, let's even go more extreme, a 1-foot window. And this would have been a moment where we should deactivate, because now every time we make a change, we have to wait for all of the panels to be updated. But we could be a little more extreme. And I will deactivate. What I'm going to do is change, we just changed 3 to 1. I'm going to change 11 to 12. And then I'm going to make the sampling just 2 versions. And what that should do is that we should have either a 12-foot piece of glass or a 1-foot piece of glass. Now we can see 1-foot pieces of glass through here. But now let's deactivate for a second. And let's set that to be, we know that the overall height is 13. So I'll set this to 12. And then let me set the sample to 2. And I believe what should happen is that we'll either get a 12-foot piece of glass or a 1-foot piece of glass. It's not what I want in the end, but I'm doing it to confirm that as it relates to the role of the sampling. So now we can see that we either have very narrow 1-foot windows or very tall 12-foot windows. So we can also get a sense where we're getting some shading. Not sure what's happening in terms of orientation. These two orientations look pretty close to one another. And I don't believe we're actually we're not using the shading devices as part of the radiation analysis yet either. So while that produces a kind of extreme facade, let's deactivate and then let's set maybe the sampling back to, that would be 11. I don't know, let's set it to 22 now. We should see a really subtle change between those. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else we want to set while we're here. We could increase the deletion of the windows. Maybe we go to 5 feet instead of 4 feet. We could set the vertical, so the shading is vertical, but rather than it just being tied to the window, we could change that 1 to 0, set that to false, and it will come back and, all right, so these have the same seed. Actually, we have the same seed throughout. That was in my rush in terms of copying all of those. We can see there's some updates that are still happening. And there could be a slight delay. We could also deactivate solar analysis. Is there anything else? And there was something updating there. So we have those 3. Actually, even the 4th one. So I'm going to set all of those to false. Now we shouldn't have any delay in terms of modifying anything here. And I think what I want to do is also increase, again, remember, turn these on and get a sense for them. We could increase them a little bit to be somewhere around 200 for the top 2 and the bottom. And then maybe we want to be 350, 400 in the 3 middle floors. We can just give it a quick spin, see if we like the random staggered panels. Looks okay. Let's hide the surface. And let's reactivate our analysis as well as our panel generation. I think with increasing the number of divisions, we may be able to slide the color-coded mesh of the solar radiation behind our panels, which I think will look a little bit better. And so here we see the difference of the full vertical shading device, the fin that's coming off the panel. It's no longer tied to just the window. It's tied to the whole panel. And let's see, with maybe a few more divisions, it looks a little better. We're still having, there's still some moments where the mesh is peeking out through the panel. But here we have a sense where it's blue and purple. We're getting larger panels in terms of the glazing. And then these are also pretty large, but as we move around, then we start to get kind of minimized. The minimum is kind of minimal for me. I do want to make a couple of quick changes while I'm here. Hide the mesh. I want to set the shade, window shade back to be tied to the window. And we can leave it vertical. We can have it coming out. And I want to set the minimum window opening, maybe 2.5. And then the panel width. See, you can play with these. You can play with the fraction of the panel width, depending on how many subdivisions you have in the randomization and what looks good with that. But I think I'm in a pretty good spot with concluding this. And just, I'll recap slightly to just talk about a couple of the components in the workflow for what we see here. There are other tutorials available for the SkinDesigner. And as I said, work with a good consultant to really make some of these decisions if you're getting into some of this analysis. I would want to really look at some of the results that we're getting for some of these things. But overall, we have a custom set of panels with shading elements tied in here. And so as you think about building panels, you can see we worked with a wall panel, a window, and a shading device. These plugged into the panel system. We wrote a definition for that. We use the skin generator. We have the preview panel to help us see what one panel looks like. And then we also use the controller as a way to set the height based on the data. I'll tell you too that theoretically, it should be possible to do this same thing with the shading device, but I struggled. I think there were some things that were off within that because I really wanted to develop a custom shading element also based on that solar radiation information. And I just couldn't get it to work. I noticed that a few things were off in terms of the toggles. And in the end, I didn't want to lead you down a path where something might be a little buggy. And so this should give you the overall workflow to give you a really simple sense of developing some panels, having a couple of key parameters to be able to control some of these things. And here I just gave you the geometry and set you up in a really simple way to be able to develop this as a tool. You can also have multiple panels. You can swap them in and out and alternate them. If you're really interested in this, you can get into much more detail. But I thought this would be a fun example to both share some geometry with you so that you could kind of jumpstart what you were looking at with the facade and introduce you to this tool and build on what we had done with LadyBug in the previous tutorial. So I hope you have some fun with this. I hope this really opens up some possibilities for you for your studio work and for other coursework or professional work, depending on where you are. ideally both. And please let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, happy modeling. So thanks for paying attention, and watch for the next tutorial, and consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. Thanks.